on the book of Esther that we started last week. And so just a little bit of background, even less background this week than last week. But Esther happens after the people of Israel have returned from Babylon. They have rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. But Esther and Mordecai and some of the other Jews stayed in that area. And so this story is going to be taking place not in Israel, but in Susa, which is the capital of this, at this time, of the Persian Empire. So it's just giving that setting for us for the story. So in Persia, the exiled Jews, I mean these are still exiled, I guess. They are living there, and the queen of Persia decides not to obey the king. And so a new competition is given to be king. Esther is chosen. And one of the things that we find out about Esther is that she won the favor of actually many people so that she could become the queen. She's a Jewish orphan. Parents are both dead. Mordecai, her cousin or uncle, depending on your translation, raises her. And when she is brought into the harem, she pleases the one who's in charge of it. She's good in his eyes, and so he favors her and does great things for her, puts her at the front of the line. She goes before the king. The king chooses her because she's also the best of all those choices at that time. That's Esther is the queen at that point. So having got to that point, we want to talk about other parts of the story. And in particular, we want to talk about what happens between Haman and Mordecai. And this starts in the 3rd chapter. Haman, we're told, is an Agagite. That's hard to say. But he's an Agagite that is raised up to be the second in the kingdom of Persia. And so clearly the king trusts him very much. But as a part of raising him to that spot, he tells everyone that they have to bow down to Haman. When he goes outside, Mordecai doesn't bow down to him. And because of that, Haman has the biggest hissy fit ever for someone who is unhappy with not being honored. And he decides, not only does Mordecai need to die, but all the Jews need to die. What's important for us to think about is who these two men are. I don't know how good your basis of knowledge is, or if you see it in this, because it took me a little bit to figure it out too. Haman the Agagite is a descendant of Agag, who was the king of the Amalekites, when Saul was told to go destroy the Amalekites. And he doesn't kill Agag, but Samuel does. This is about 1000 BC, and we're about 478 BC when Esther happens. So 500 years before this, Haman's ancestors had been defeated by the Israelites, and specifically Saul. Mordecai, you'll notice in this passage, is the son of Kish. Who else was the son of Kish? King Saul. King Saul was the son of Kish. So Mordecai is a descendant of those who are related to Saul, which feels like, all the way in Susa, a really wild coincidence that two people who have ancestors that were enemies are put so close in this situation now. Did they know this? I don't know. If Haman was often called the Agagite, maybe. I feel like I put too many ags in that one. maybe Mordecai knew it. Did Haman know who Mordecai was? I just don't know. But maybe when we talk about the fact that he decides he wants to kill all the Jews and he's in a place where he has the power to do it, doesn't this add something to the story? That maybe there was deep inside of him burning that hatred for the Jews because of what had happened to his ancestor. And now he's in a place where he can accomplish that. I don't know. But the whole story moves forward because of that. So we had to talk about his hatred for them. So, of course, when Mordecai finds out, take another step back. Haman goes to the king, gets a decree, bribes the king with a lot to get the decree that on a certain day, all the Jews can be killed and all their possessions taken away. When Mordecai finds out about it, he begins to mourn, tears his garments, sackcloth and ashes. He's in mourning because of that. In fact, the 4th chapter, verses 1 through 3, describes about the mourning, not just of Mordecai, but of all the Jews. Because by law now, they can be killed on that one day. And Esther hears about it in verse 4. She hears about Mordecai's very public mourning because it's right in front of the palace. And she's deeply distressed by what's happening to the one who took care of her and raised her. She's in anguish because of this. It seems like she doesn't know what's going on yet. But because of that, she takes clothing and sends it to Mordecai so that he can get dressed. And he refuses. And he sends a message back to Esther and says to her, I want you to go to the king. I want you to beg the king. I want you to seek his mercy or his favor. I want you to plead for the people of Israel. And what is Esther's reply to this? Of course, they were having to do this by messenger, right? Esther says, look, if I go before the king without permission, that's death. Unless he extends the scepter and says that it's okay. And then she says, I haven't been called to see the king in 30 days. I don't know how kings treated queens back then, but to not see your queen for 30 days seems wrong. Something's not right about that whole situation. Esther is implying in that statement, though, he hasn't wanted to see me for this amount of time. So going before the king would definitely be death. So in the 4th chapter, in verse 13, we have Mordecai's very famous statement back to her. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Do you think you're going to get away? Do you think you're going to escape just because you're in the palace? Which is an interesting question. The implication, I think this shows to us how fearful the Jews were at this moment, how dangerous of a place it was to be a Jew at that time. You're not going to escape, is what Mordecai is saying. And if you keep silence, if you choose not to go before the king because you think you're going to die, God will take care of it. I love Mordecai's confidence, don't you? Relief and deliverance are going to come. They're going to come somehow. You could do something, but if you don't, God's got it. Do you have that kind of confidence in God? But if you don't do anything, you and your family will perish. And then he says, the thing that really gets to Esther, I think, who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And the implications behind that is, this is how God has given a deliverance to the people of Israel. You're the one. You're in this place specifically because God wants you to be here. This passage reminds us that we don't know God's plans to such fine details. It's hard to comprehend what exactly his will is. And Esther didn't know that either. How do we cope with knowing what the right plan of action is? What the right decision is? Not just for myself, but in this case, for Esther, for a whole nation. Israel knew that Jehovah would bless them, but only as long as they were faithful. And these Jews are still in a place where they had not been as faithful as they should have been in the past. And so they're still growing and learning. So often when we look at this passage from Mordecai and the wisdom of Mordecai here, we put the focus on such a time as this. I think there's even a song, I think it's in the Blue Supplement, that's called Such a Time as This. And there's a part that I understand that. Dangerous and difficult times happen. Was this the only time the Jews faced danger? Was this the only time that they faced extermination, genocide, being dealt with poorly? Dangerous and difficult times happen. Maybe for us, there's a danger because we're kind of complacent about it. We've never faced that kind of a situation for the most part. We don't face that kind of persecution or outrage or hatred. But we still can face some very dangerous situations, both from within the church and without the church. So there are such a time as this, even right now, right? There are still things that need to be done for God's kingdom. There are still moments that define us. It's such a time as this. And there are times when, even in those difficult circumstances, we don't know what to do. We face the dilemmas. And maybe those times we even feel like there are no good choices. Put yourself in Esther's shoes at that time. Are there good choices? There's no easy decision there. Look at what her original response was to this situation. If I go, I'm going to die. That's essentially what she thought. So at times like this, there's always times like this. How do we choose? But I think we miss the point that Mordecai was making, because he wasn't talking about just this time. He says, whether you have come to the kingdom. And really what he's talking about is not the time, but the role Esther has. What role do you have right now? I think it would be really hard for Esther to think in her mind that she became the queen without the help of Jehovah. In fact, the first part of the story implies that all the way, that she had that much favor, that she became the queen. She's orphaned. How does she get to be the queen? It's not about the times, it's about who you are and what you're going to do. You've come to this place. Because if there's always such a time as this, then there always needs to be an Esther. I like the way he says this. Don't think to yourself that. But isn't that so often what we do when we are brought into situations like this, is we kind of think to ourselves, don't think to yourself, well, I'm safe. Because Mordecai is saying, you're definitely not safe. But do you ever do that in situations where you know a decision needs to be made, where you're facing this great dilemma, and you think to yourself, no, I'm safe. I don't need to do anything. It's not that. We rationalize those kinds of thoughts. Don't think to yourself, I'm just going to keep silent and it'll go away. Well, definitely Mordecai is making the point God will accomplish his purpose, and that's great. But Mordecai also says there's going to be consequences. If you don't do what you can do now, you and your family will perish anyway. Essentially, what he's saying to her is, you're going to die one way or another if you do nothing. Don't think to yourself, well, it's not my job. How easy would it have been for Esther to stand back there and just say, well, it's not my job. Did the queen really have any power in Persia? And as you look at what happened to the first queen, Vashti, I think that's there for a reason, not just that Esther became the queen, but it shows us the queen didn't have power. The king had power, and his advisors had power. The queen was a decoration. She didn't have power. Maybe she could have sat back and said, well, it's not my job. Isn't that kind of what Moses did at the burning bush? When God talked to him out of the burning bush, he said, I want you to go to Egypt and deliver my people. What was his response? You can't mean me, right? It's not. This is the situation Esther is being put in also, only it's Mordecai telling her essentially the same thing. Are you willing to be used by God to accomplish his purpose? It's not about the time. It's about who you are. Who are you in these difficult circumstances? And what I love is that Esther listened to what Mordecai said. And I'm going to suggest to you, this shows us an incredible wisdom on her part that she was willing to listen. And this is not about her being a woman or even younger. She's actually kind of in a position where it would have been easy for her to choose not to listen, isn't she? Mordecai, I'm the queen. I don't have to listen to what you have to say. I'm not your daughter. I don't have to listen to what you have to say. I'm not a child anymore. I don't have to listen to what you say. But Esther chooses the path of wisdom, which is to listen to what other godly people say. And hear in what Mordecai was saying, the voice of God. You're here in this place now so that you can act. And that's where we see then the courage of Esther. In the 4th chapter and in verse 16, her reply when Mordecai says that, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. You can't find a more brave statement than that right there, can you? She prepares herself knowing the consequences. Do you see that, first of all? She understands that there are some things that are of more value than our physical lives. So she submits herself to God's will and puts her trust in him. But she doesn't do that alone. I don't know exactly how the court at Persia was set up, but I'm willing to bet there weren't a lot of Jewish girls in the harem that they could just hang around together. She probably felt very alone at that moment and in that time. But even at that, she goes to Mordecai and she says, you call everybody together. Get all the Jews you can in Susa, and we're going to fast 3 days, 3 nights, no eating, all of you and me. Now, what's not mentioned here is what goes along with the fasting. But when you hear fasting, what else occurs to your mind? Fasting is often connected with prayer, right? Fasting and prayer. It's not mentioned here, but I'm going to guess that during those 3 days of fasting, that they weren't just twiddling their thumbs. This was a moment, such a time as this, where the Jews were in dire danger. They fast, they pray for 3 days. She gathers allies to join her. We forget that sometimes. Sometimes there's a part of us that thinks courage is being able to do it all on my own. I'm the big hero, I'm the Superman, and I can do it by myself. But Esther doesn't think that way. And even though she's all alone, probably in the palace, she gathers her allies. Let's join together. Let's do this together. And the help she asks for? Fasting and praying. She doesn't consider fasting and praying doing nothing or something meaningless, even though it's not really tangible. And here's what I think is fantastic. Mordecai listens to her. And that's something sometimes as Christians we forget that point of how important it is, not just that I listen to you, but that you listen to me. In the sense that we listen to each other. Mordecai, I want you to go gather all the Jews in Susa. All? They didn't have Google. How was he going to find as many Jews as possible in Susa? I'm sure they lived in the same areas. It was a big job, don't you think? That she's asking him to do a big thing. They listened to her. That's a great interaction. So they appeal to God through the fasting. And the key is, in the 5th chapter in verse 2, she goes before the king. Let's start in verse 1. And on the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Did you notice that word again that was our first point last week? Why did she gain the favor? We talked about how important this is. Last week it was she did what was necessary to be put in that place and gain favor among the people. She's still doing that with the king. And that was so important. We need to excel. We need to gain favor with people so that when the time comes, we can be accepted. She'd already shown that other people wanted to be around her. And here she is. Her demeanor is going to be her greatest tool against Haman. The way that she carries herself. I find it incredible that she has done this. I'm trying to make a decision at this point because I have one more long section about Esther. And I feel like maybe I should do another lesson about Esther next week, but I feel like I'm dragging this out too long. I think I've learned a lot from Esther. and it's really stories that we really need to learn. And we know more about Esther than a lot of the other women of the Bible. So I think next week we will. We'll just put next week for that part. What I hope we learn from the lesson today is what Esther shows as that sense of courage. She listened to the message. She understood she must have this role. And then with courage, she acted. And she didn't act alone. She got others to help her with that. Esther is a great example of a woman with courage. Okay, so next week we'll finish this lesson theoretically next week and finish talking about Esther. If you are a brother or sister in Christ, perhaps you're at one of those points in your life, such a time as this. Maybe such a time as this isn't about all of us, but it is for you. That you need prayers and help. That you need someone to be fasting and praying and encouraging and comforting you. Will you let us join you in that? If you need our help, or perhaps if you're not a brother or sister in Christ and you believe that Jesus is the Christ, you're ready to be baptized and be saved, for either reason, will you please come forward as we stand and sing?